Hello, WordCamp Santa Clarita. My name is Taylor Arndt, and today we're going to be talking about importance of making your WordPress backend accessible. Before I get into my slides, I have a couple housekeeping things I will go over. First off, if you would like to follow along, these slides are located at taylorstechtalks.com/slides. So taylorstechtalks.com/slides is where you are able to find this presentation if you would like to refer back to it later. With that out of the way, let's get started, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. As stated earlier, we're going to be talking about the importance of making your backend WordPress websites accessible. Background about myself: my name is Taylor Arndt. I've been in the accessibility field for the past 3 years now. I own my own company, Taylor's Accessibility Services, LLC, where I help companies become more inclusive and get online. Being blind since birth, I understand how important accessibility is for everyone, and I understand what is needed to try to make people more accessible. Introduction. You most likely understand that websites need to be accessible on the front end for your users to interact, but you may not think about how having an accessible backend can negatively affect users as well. And your backend could be where you have an employee edit your site if you are a company who depends on WordPress, for example, a township who has a blind employee that needs to edit their department. And this is actually something true that has happened to me, where the township came to me and was like, we want to make our website accessible. That's great, but we need to make sure that the back end's accessible, because you never know if you're going to get somebody who's blind or has another disability, and the plugins that you guys choose to use on the back end will make their job impossible. So we want to think about that as well, not just for townships, but for everyone, because you never know who's going to be on the other side editing your sites. Or not even editing, but who has to interact with your sites as well. There are many benefits to making your backend accessible, and most of the time, people don't think about these. Why make your WordPress backend accessible? Ensuring all parties are able to make changes to your website. So whether that's like an editor, or, for example, let's say that you have tech support and they use a support ticket system based on WordPress, and they may have a disability of some sort, they need to be able to make changes. Or even if you use some of those WordPress employee tracking plugins for HR, and if you have everything through WordPress, or even as stated, like a CRM as well. So allowing people to edit the back end is very important to make sure that you are a fully inclusive company for all. Without accessibility, you may be locking future parties from editing your website, which could be very bad if you are hiring somebody to help you edit, or you are employing them to ensure that you are accessible if you're doing an audit later on. And let's just be frank, it's the right thing to do. Having an accessible backend is the right thing to do. It's just the right thing to do in this era is to make sure your front end and your back end are fully accessible for all. Considerations before your website is constructed. There are a few things that need to be done to ensure your backend is fully accessible. Have a good idea of the themes and plugins wanting to be used before you actually start. This will help to ensure that a good plan is mapped out so that you are able to ensure that those plugins are fully accessible. Research all theme and plugin options for potential accessibility barriers and to do a general accessibility audit before implementing them. And when you're doing this audit, make sure that they're fully accessible on the back end as well as the front end. So having that double-pronged accessibility approach will definitely be a useful area here. Another thing that can commonly trip people up is their developers. Ensure that the developers that you use have the same commitment to accessibility as you do. This will definitely go a long way to ensuring everyone is more accessible. Because if you work with developers who understand the importance of accessibility when developing your site, they can help you to be able to make sure that your site is fully accessible. Because a lot of developers these days don't know about accessibility, nor do they know about the back-end accessibility. In fact, very few do. So having a developer, for example, who has a disability could actually be a good asset because they can be able to help you with both. So that could be a cool approach to take. And that's where somebody like myself could come in. Get an accessibility expert in the very early stages. This will ensure that your plugin and theme selections and your intended plan is going to work as expected. So an accessibility expert can tell you what themes and plugins will work well and what ones won't. So for example, myself or somebody else who is very familiar with WordPress accessibility, we deal with plugins on a daily basis, and so we will have the expertise to be able to tell what plugins and what themes will help you to be able to make the most accessible site for what you're trying to achieve. There's also other ways of doing this as well. Definitely, like I said, reaching out to the plugin developer, the theme developer, if there are issues. But again, having that accessibility person on hand that can answer your questions will definitely serve you well. Choosing a theme for your needs. So we have talked a lot about the considerations before website construction, which is great. But now we're going to talk about the theme selection and the plugin selection, because these are the next two areas where we have to really be careful about how we design our sites. So, for example, the theme that I use exclusively is called GeneratePress. A lot of you all probably have heard of it. I like it because it's accessible on both the front and the back end. So it's very important that the theme that you choose is accessible on both ends. And it does produce very accessible output. And it's fully accessible for a blind developer or another developer with a disability to edit like myself. So in my little agency/business thing, I exclusively use GeneratePress because their commitment to accessibility and how accessible it is on the front end and the back end. The developer is very committed to accessibility for all. If there's an issue, he will fix it. So he is really awesome. Tom is really great. And I'd highly recommend giving GeneratePress a try on your next project. There are many themes available. However, choosing one that meets the accessibility standards can be a very difficult task because there are so many themes to choose from. And just because a theme says that it is accessibility ready may not always be accessibility. So they test some themes, for example, on WordPress.org, and it says accessibility ready. But just because it's accessibility ready does not mean that it's fully accessible. So just keep that in mind. Always do your own independent audit and review to make sure that the theme you selected will be fully accessible on the front and back end. Okay, finally, diving deep into plugins. So this is where a lot of people get stuck. Plugins are one of those death traps because they can be accessible on the back end or they can be completely inaccessible. WordPress is by default accessible. It's just what you do on the back end and the front end that can make it fully inaccessible, because WordPress, again, is accessible out of the box. It's just what is done that could make it inaccessible. So just keep that in mind, that by default, you always have an accessible WordPress site. It's just what you do to make it inaccessible can definitely have a very negative impact. And a lot of that has to do with your theme and your plugins. So let's dive deep into some plugins. Plugins are obviously an important component of any website. We already understand that, right? Because they help us with our functionality, they help extend functionality, they help add functionality. Without plugins, we don't have a website. That's just the truth of the matter. So we already get that we need plugins. That's fine. Choosing plugins can be extremely difficult. I understand, because there are so many available. In fact, I can argue that there can be too many plugins available sometimes. So trying to find ones that meet your needs is definitely one of those guessing games sometimes. What I would say is conduct reviews of all plugins that are intended for use and make sure the backend is fully accessible. And again, having somebody like myself or somebody else on your team during the website build process can definitely help with this step. If you're committed to accessibility, then making sure that you have somebody with a disability on the team, again, is going to be your best way to ensure that your website's fully accessible for all. So making sure that they can do the screen reader audits, do the magnification, make sure it's accessible for low vision, make sure it has all the other WCAG component accessibility. That is definitely going to be the key to making sure you have an accessible site. If you're unsure of the accessibility, which you probably are in most instances, get them reviewed for accessibility. That is going to be the easiest way to ensure that you are fully accessible on the back end and the front end, is get your site reviewed and have an expert on hand during the build process. All right, this wraps up the presentation, and now I will open it up for some question and answers, and hopefully we can create more accessible backends. So with that, I hope to see you all later, and thank you for allowing me to present today.